Greetings and welcome to Theology Roundtable, a weekly summary of this week's news from the specific lens of theology. I'm your host, Vincent Rocchio, and with me today from Bellarmine University is Justin Klassen. From Salem State University in Salem, Massachusetts, Liz Duclos-Orsello. And from Boston University in Boston, Massachusetts, Nicolette Manglos-Weber. Today we're going to be talking about a number of issues. We want to start, however, with the tornado that hit Mississippi. Several people killed, enormous amounts of damage. It was, in some respects, being called a very rare kind of tornado. But as we've seen, what's becoming rare, or what's been considered rare, is becoming more and more common as climate changes affect our environment more and more. So, Liz, I wanted to ask you, the other thing that's not so rare about this tornado is the fact that climate change in general seems to affect marginalized communities more than others.
Absolutely. Thanks, Vincent, for that. It's exactly how I would frame this. This tornado, hearing about a tornado, hearing about yet another natural disaster, but this one in particular in Mississippi, sadly, didn't strike me as unusual in any way. The issue at hand is that we've always had in this country, I'm talking specifically about the United States, a question of environmental justice, where racialized minorities, by minoritized populations, whether that be by lower socioeconomic status folks or people who are BIPOC, historically in this country have been marginalized into geographic places within communities, within cities, within states, that put them at greater risk at all times for the devastation that's going to happen when natural disasters strike. I mean, many of us can remember Katrina and the horrors that happened in Katrina, and thinking about why certain parts of the city of New Orleans, particularly the lower Ninth Ward, were so much more devastated than other parts of the city. And that is a history of racial marginalization and oppression that put certain populations consistently at the forefront of environmental disaster. So, thinking about this from the standpoint of social justice, the standpoint of what faith teachings would lead us to consider, is to think about who are we here to care for? Who are we responsible for? And how we live that out. And there's two threads that come together for me. One is the idea of care for what we call in my community of faith at the moment, the care for our common home, right? How do we be attentive to the needs of this planet that we share, this one beautiful floating orb. And at the same time, what often is a different track of conversation, which is about how do we attend to the issues of equity and justice, particularly around race, and particularly trying to address and redress the kinds of real devastation that have happened in communities, in civil society, through governments, through policies, and frankly, with the church at times propping up and propagating that kind of marginalization. I just want to say something else here. It's interesting to me. This week, I was talking with some of my students. I teach at a university. I was talking with some of my students about this tornado and thinking specifically about the issue of environmental justice and why and how certain people are impacted more than most. And they were quick to bring up, which made me happy, the fact that there is a very, very, very well-known photograph by an American photojournalist, Margaret Bourke-White, that is from the 1930s, and it actually is called Breadline after the Louisville flood. And I know one of our compatriots here today is in Louisville, and that is a breadline. That is a photo of a group of exclusively Black Louisville residents standing in a bread line, waiting to receive food after a flood that devastated not all of, but very specific parts of Louisville during the Great Depression. And they are standing in front of a advertising billboard that has a picture of a white family in a car that says, "There's no way like the American way, world's highest standard of living." And I mean, the irony, of course, is not lost on 18 to 22-year-olds, and it's not lost on us here. But thinking about this tornado just brought back the fact that this is a story in this country that is an ongoing one. And communities of faith, to my mind, need to be thinking long and hard about how we link these two threads of the work that we do and how we think about the work of people of faith in the United States, that there is a direct line between environmental degradation and racialized oppression, marginalization, and the pain that comes from it. I suppose there have been faith leaders speaking out about this, maybe in the local news, but at a national level, I have not heard of anyone making those links and thinking about this in a way that I think might be productive.
Thinking about this in relation to, working in an environment where we train religious leaders, we train ministers and have for many years, and how in that space, even the questions around space, land, the environment, ecological justice are just so, new and emerging as opposed to an established part of the curriculum. We do now have an ecological justice certificate, but that's only in the last few years. And I think there's a way in which both academic theology and then, the everyday theologies of religious leadership have followed the culture, so to speak, of thinking of the environment as having just sort of endless possibility, and it's here to serve us, and and there's no particular reason to not use it, to not exploit it, and to not move to somewhere better if we have the means to do so, and leave those who don't behind. That we really don't have a lot of skill or precedent or even models for thinking about these problems theologically, right? As, someone with another foot in sociology, I know that how, even within the social sciences, looking at the connection between communities, inequity, and environmental issues is still pretty new, right? But I think even theology, by which I mean academic theology as well as the lived theologies of religious communities, are so ill-equipped to speak to those issues.
Yeah, I think one of the things that occurs to me as an obstacle in this regard for American religious people is that it's been pretty difficult to think in broader ways than just individual intentionality about love and about sin, both. And so the idea of structural arrangements that that actually are destructive to what God has made to flourish, that would be something that the reparative power of love should address. It's a big leap for a lot of people. And I know that, for my undergraduate students, one of the ways that they are maybe saying something new about this is they are, like many young people today, they're kind of among those growing numbers of nuns. They don't have, a particular religious tradition that they are affiliated with. But it's interesting because I think that they are making that choice in part because they actually are deeply attuned to the spiritual realities that they actually discover and find in space and land and nature. I think it's really interesting that a year ago we had this panel, our campus ministry put it on, where they invited a few people, and I was one of the panelists, to talk about how your worldview impacts your relationship to the environment. And so, we it was like a Zoom thing because it was during the pandemic. So we recorded these talks before. And before the event started, they played this video that they had done. So one of the staff had gone around campus asking people about like spirituality and nature, their connection, religion and nature, basically. And so many of the people that were interviewed, staff members, but also students, especially in a younger demographic, they said things like, oh, I'm not religious. Like, it was kind of like someone's in my face asking me about, I'm not religious. Like, duh, I'm not, but then they would say, but I really do feel like the place where I encountered the divine is at the park or under the trees or with the, and so they actually have, when they see a different, in my classes on environmental ethics, I see a real affinity for other ways of thinking about the connection between the divine. And it's kind of interesting because on the one hand, it's like, well, this is so foreign to Western Christian ideas. But on the other hand, a student just the other day pointed out, we were reading some Ojibwe writers, and they're kind of describing their that the theft of land wasn't just the theft of property. That's how the Western mind is conceived of it. It was actually the theft of like religious practice and identity and all this stuff. And one of my students talked about, that's actually that reminds me of St. Francis of Assisi. So it's weird because the Christian tradition has elevated some understandings that are really integrating spirituality with the material creation, and yet you would get laughed out of a church if you actually lived like St. Francis today. So there's this real irony there.
If I may, can I just loop back to something that you said, or that I guess as we've just moved through this conversation, I'm struck by the fact of thinking about folks who live in environmentally degraded spaces, right? Where what is the quote unquote natural world is a brown field, or is the edge of a ravine where there's a train trestle that goes through, right? Where if there's a derailment, you're going to be the first people impacted. And I do think that it's interesting to think about what the quote unquote natural world or wilderness feels like, looks like. Are those sacred spaces for people for whom those spaces are actually potentially dangerous, like physically dangerous, and maybe not spiritually fulfilling? And it's just such a different perspective. I hear you, Justin, and I'm someone who grew up in really in the woods, and I've written blog posts, I have written other things on theology, tattoos, and running in the woods. Things like this, and how this all sort of comes together. But, thinking about what happens when you're living in a place where if, that if there's a hard rainfall, or the wind blows too hard, or there's this tornado, all that stuff that's called quote unquote nature is actually going to put you and your family at risk. And how do we grapple, right? How do we grapple with that when, at least from a Christian standpoint, there's this vision of the world as this beautiful gift that we all have to share? So I sort of sit with that. I don't answer, but I sit with it,
Liz, because it actually reminds me of a tweet I saw today where, someone was tongue-in-cheek saying, quoting, I go to nature, I find spirituality and I find transcendence. And then, they have a picture of some kind of brutal practice of a bird that throws the babies out of the nest that aren't, and it's indicating nature has a certain brutality to it, right, as well. And I think that is a case in point, because I do think that's part of the motivation for climate denial, actually. It's not just sort of heartless, selfish, we don't care about the people that are affected, because we're all going to be affected eventually. I think we don't like to think as, Americans with economic security, we don't like to think about the vulnerable place that the natural world puts us in. right? We don't like to think about our existential insecurity in relation to things like natural disasters and hurricanes and fires, right? And so when they happen, we have very, I think, complex and even sophisticated, if you want to say it that way, ways of articulating our denial, and that these are one-off things, or they're rare things, or they're not happening to me, in a way that, like you say, the most vulnerable and marginalized communities aren't able to do. I mean, the last 5 or 6 years I've been, which I'll speak to again, I think later in the program, but I've been doing research in the country of Uganda, and nobody there is a climate denier. You cannot find a climate change denier in the country, no matter what their religious belief system, no matter their theology. It is plain as day to everyone that the climate has changed, that it has gotten hotter, that it is raining less, that you can't grow the same food you could grow, 40 years ago. And so there's no room or capacity for denial. And I think our capacity yeah.
Could we pick up right there then, Nicolette, with Uganda? I'm wondering if, the same kinds of insecurities that are being raised with climate change, because as you point out, no one's in denial. Things are going to get scarce. Is there a relationship between that insecurity and their recent legislation that you could elaborate on for us?
Yeah, I mean, the connection very simply is neoliberal capitalism and the exploitation of the environment that it engenders, as well as the authoritarianism, the state level authoritarianism and state violence that it enables, right? I mean, that's the link there. The reason why climate change is so apparent there is in part because their environment has been directly and brutally exploited by quote unquote development that they've experienced over the last 30 to 40 years. And so some of it is obviously regional, but a lot of it is localized to, the deforestation, the extraction of resources, the closing off of water sources, right? This is all what development has meant in Uganda. And what development has also meant in Uganda is a strong centralized state that is propped up by its relationships to global corporations and foreign governments. It's really important to think about this anti-homosexuality legislation as an instance of state violence, right? Because there's we have Ugandan LGBTQ activists who are students at Boston University School of Theology right now, actually, who are here under refugee status. And homosexuality is not new in Uganda. It is not a Western import the way that it's been described. What is new is this kind of collective fear and targeting of LGBTQ queer persons as in part a rationale for broader suppression of social activism, right? This new law is very strategic in the way that it targets not just people who are out publicly gay, right? See, we've had that law before. What this law targets is people who have been accused of essentially suggesting or petitioning a same-sex relationship, right? Or supporting homosexuality. It's very vague and nearly impossible to disprove these kinds of accusations. And what it is a way it provides a legal rationale for the state to jail more young social activists with impunity. So I really do hesitate. I caution a lot of my students in talking about this is that, rather than seeing Uganda as just sort of a long-running homophobic traditional society, no, that's not what's going on here. In fact, there have been, since the HIV/AIDS era, evangelical activists like Rick Warren, who went to Uganda infamously in the mid-'80s, likened homosexuality to pedophilia. He linked the two, such that culturally, many people think of homosexuals as, and I'm using their language, right? Think of homosexuals as predators. They're not just people who want to express and live out their gender or sexual identity. They are predators because they've been linked discursively by even white evangelical, Western evangelical activists with pedophilia and threat to children. And so that's why laws like this are used by the state to drum up public support. They play on parents' fears, and then they put political leaders in power who then also use the legislation to target what is really an emerging youth resistance and revolution movement happening in Uganda.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, the thing that interests me is, and I'm sort of asking this of all of you, where does that energy and that mandate come from in terms of Western Christianity? I'm not a biblical scholar. I've been known to crack a verse here and there, and I just don't see a whole lot in what we Christians call the New Testament that rages against homosexuality, LGBTQ lifestyle. Like, where is this mandate coming from?
If I could respond to that briefly, I think Nicolette was really describing it in a different way from, even though it's often, I think there is like a regressive sexual ethic at play, but there is even more is a sort of preference for order, like a certain a way of understanding order. And order is existentially comforting if it benefits you. And it is also economically efficient in certain ways, or at least that is how state governments often see it. And so when I think of the anti-biblical nature of this kind of legislation and, even this kind of previous activism on the part of Western Christians, I think of its preference for order over justice, its preference for stability and permanence of the status quo over the dignity of every individual person. And the thing about, like, every Christian institution in the West has emphasized the importance of intrinsic dignity, and that's rooted in the Christian tradition and its theological anthropology. And yet we kind of let that language be mild and sweet and harmless. But intrinsic dignity is, in fact, always a radical call to challenge and revise the status quo whenever the dignity of human beings is infringed. And all human beings are, it also signals that their dignity far transcends any measure in a hierarchical order. So the idea, I feel like it's, this is about putting people in a place so that we can understand them and comprehend them. And that also makes me think of the fear around trans persons in this country too, that it's about like that, wait a minute, we might have to actually respect people as persons rather than having the comforts of this nice tidy system where everybody fits in a particular place. And it's a really reactionary kind of fear of instability. And to me, what I think of first is like Jesus talking about human beings were not made for the Sabbath. In other words, human beings were not made to serve some order, right? In fact, like, he's completely indifferent to the notion of like just of some kind of permanent stability. But yeah, existentially, that's very, like, even on an individual level, it's scary. And, but the benefit of it, right, is if you go through to the other side, you actually have real relationships of love. That is, you're related to people, not to some, structure, right? And,
I'll just say real quickly, Justin, that that verse that, humans were made for the Sabbath, or
Other way around.
The Sabbath,
Yeah.
the Sabbath was made for humans, not humans for the Sabbath. That actually has become kind of a mantra for me in the work that I do, and looking at the interplay of sociology and theology, that in social institutions are made for people, but people aren't made for the social institutions, right?
Yep.
And the idea that if it's not serving the people, we change them.
Yes, absolutely. They and that to me is like the primary obstacle to change as well, is this idea that a lot of people have, that it's like, well, this is how it's always been. Like, how, we can't, and this is how it is, and there are lots of things like that function like, and that's, I mean, from a theological standpoint, that's an idol. That's not actually worthy of devotion. So.
And Justin, I want to hear more of what you have to say about this issue in this country, because I know that's another hot topic for this week. But I'm struck as you're all talking that, it wasn't that long. Two things. One, it was not that long ago in this country that other biblical passages were being used to say things like interracial marriage is not only unlawful, it is unlawful. It is both unlawful and is partly unlawful because it is ungodly and is against the Bible, right? Christian people saying that, right? It was the 1960s that the Supreme Court finally struck down the bans against interracial marriage. And, there were activists 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, who were quoting scripture. God made man, I mean, that was a generic term, but God made man in his likeness, in his image. To speak about this travesty of laws that were devastating families, forcing people to not live their lives as themselves. W.E.B. Du Bois, who was a Massachusetts, son of Massachusetts, and was very much a supporter of a very underknown painter who painted a brilliant work that raised this question about the notion of people of color having to choose to let their children, quote unquote, pass as white if they were fair enough to do so, because they were living in a country that would deny them their humanity, right? And Du Bois writes about this brilliantly in like 1915, This is state-sponsored violence, to your point, Nicolette. This was the United States Congress forcing, through laws, people to make choices about whether they could live as themselves. Could you be a Black person and an American? Could you have to pick one or the other? If you had the physiology to deny one part of yourself, would you choose to do that? Right? This is, again, these histories are just devastating. And again, there were some people at the time, some religious leaders who seemed to see this as a theological conundrum, and many who did not. And we sit with that today. And I also, Nicolette, was struck by your commentary about what's going on in Uganda being, really a combined product of both the environmental degradation and these new laws of the neoliberalism, really, which, frankly, I tend to want to place right back in the hands of the settler colonial states that devastated most of the African continent for so long. I've done some work in West Africa, and it's like, you do that, and then you sort of say in the 50s and 60s, good luck, right? And as Justin says, right, order becomes the way, and oftentimes authoritarian regimes.
Well, and I'll stop you there, Liz, because initially it was, okay, good luck,
Yeah.
And then 10, 20 years later, it's like, oh, but actually we want you to do this, and we want you to let us in and take advantage of your natural resources and make sure that you play nicely with us and that you're not communist, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, if there's one thing I want people to know about the situation in Uganda, is that our government, the UN, will decry this legislation very loudly, and people will talk about, oh, Museveni, he's thwarting the control of the West, right? We send billions of dollars for military aid specifically to Uganda every year, and that will not stop. That will not stop, even if this legislation passes. It won't stop. We are literally funding the enforcement of this kind of draconian legislation.
And that goes back to what I was saying earlier about like the difficulty of, so we love the performative virtue, but we don't actually want to think about the structural implications of our moral commitments. Yeah, that's harder. It's more expensive.
Yeah, and I would like to follow up with what you were saying earlier, Justin, about fear and order, because I think it goes right to the heart of this yet another, massacre at a school with a semi-automatic or automatic rifle that was built for the express purpose of destroying as many human bodies as possible within 10 seconds. So, once again, we have politicians throwing up their arms and saying thoughts and prayers. I think what's new this time is we've actually got politicians saying, well, there's nothing that can be done. I'm just wondering, why is it that Christian America is just so comfortable with gun culture? Again, what is it about God that makes guns such an acceptable way of life? And obviously, I'm not talking about hunting here. I'm talking about this militarism and proto-militaristic appropriations of gun and gun culture that seems to be so deeply rooted precisely in fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh boy. There's probably so many. As a Canadian, this has honestly been one of the most confounding things to me about U.S. society since we lived here. Yeah. I didn't. I didn't grow up with this this reality, and now I have kids in school here in Kentucky, and who are traumatized, frankly, by all of the active shooter drills, but by every time that this happens, and the fact that there are so many of the people who defend their right to bear arms in this particular way who are also Christian, and it does make. Sometimes it really does feel like, I guess we just worship a different God. Like, is this a different religion? I don't understand, right? Like, what's really being worshipped? But from my perspective, one of the relationship to that order thing, and again, I'm saying this as a Canadian. I always tell my students anytime I'm about to say something that sounds very, very un-American, it's like you kind of worry about that, right? Am I allowed to do this or not? But it's the Constitution functions as in people's mind, not that they read it or whatever, but it functions in their minds as this unchangeability of America, and also that it must mean that America, as it's currently constituted and ordered, is the best that it could ever be. And yes, yeah, absolutely. And so the Second Amendment is obviously the prime example of that here. Now, there's also the way that the courts have interpreted it that, allows for it to imply, anybody can walk in. I remember the first place we lived here was in Texas. And my dad came and visited from Canada one time, and he's like, let's go into that pawn shop. He's like, he'd never been to Texas, right? And so we're going into the Wild West pawns. And so we're looking, just a couple of Canadian guys, right? Looking at all these guns on the wall. And there was one gun that had the barrel folded in and it had a pocket clip on it. And I said to my dad, not really speaking to the guy behind the counter, but I said to my dad, well, that's silly. I mean, you can't just walk around with a gun in your pocket. And the guy behind the counter said, I beg your pardon, right? And he had a gun in his pocket, and it was like, wow, it felt like the Wild West, right? And, but that idea of, I really do feel like one of the biblical roots of that is the unwillingness of, it goes all the way back to the kind of Constantinian shift in Western Christian history, where it's all of a sudden we didn't want to interpret, we being Western Eurocentric Christianity, didn't want to interpret any of Jesus's teachings about violence as being really serious and having real implications. People walk around talking about somehow Jesus had this really robust and strict sexual ethic, but as if he never said anything about money and violence, when he was clearly really, really emphatic about those things, right? So yeah, I do think that it is I would think about a person like William Cavanaugh in his book Migrations of the Holy, where he talks about the fact that what has really happened in the modern period is that the object of worship, that is to say, what gets treated as absolute, not worship in the sense it doesn't necessarily require incense and getting down on your knees, right? But if it's treated as an absolute, as the unquestionable, as the question you can't even ask, you can't even imagine, it's the state, and that includes its legislation on guns. So, yeah, people do feel trapped in that sense.
I think so too, and I think I do think it circles back to this question of fear and chaos and control, in a slightly different context, but I think that it is relevant. The theologian Willie Jennings talks about whiteness in terms of mastery, in terms of control, in terms that kind of run through all of our institutions, right? And so similarly, that need for that, basically like that interpretation of Christianity and Christian teaching as being about, cultural technologies of control, essentially, that what we're here to do is to take mastery of the world, take mastery of others, that's good and right, and indeed the unquestionable premise of our faith is, I think, really, really pervasive. That's the only way that I can make sense of it, right? Because I think I often have that sense too. Like you're serving a completely different God. And I lived in Texas for many years, and it was so funny.
Hey, I love Texas. I did
too. Yeah. But it was so funny how, in Austin.
Yeah, don't make Stanley Hauerwas come on here.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, I really did love it, but in Austin you have people who are from Texas and people who are transplants and people who seem like they're on the same page about all kinds of things. When you ask that question of, did you have guns in your home or do you own guns now? The people who I knew who are from Texas, they had guns. It was very comfortable and familiar part of their culture that I could never totally wrap my head around.
So I grew up in New Hampshire, and I often say to people, well, my family wasn't not even a hunting family, and we weren't a gun family, we're a hunting family, but I mean, I have very clear memories of, first day of hunting season, sort of operated as an unofficial day off of school. I mean, there was still school, but nobody wondered why, a quarter of the people weren't there. And so and New Hampshire, when I was growing up there in the 70s and 80s, was far less right-wing than it is now, and conservative in some respects. And the gun culture there has really moved to a place that in some ways rivals, what you're talking about with Texas, and, in terms of carry laws and this sort of thing. So I come from sort of that place vis-a-vis guns. Like it's not something I've never heard of or been around. But I actually have a slightly, I guess I would add, I'm not in any way opposing your takes on how we come to this. Like, how can we reconcile this kind of American love affair with guns and American Christianity, or at least the public form of performative Christianity that gets played out here? And I do, a fair amount of my work has been around trying to make sense of how community is understood in the United States. And so I spend a lot of time sort of grappling with what I think is a real tension in the United States between individualism and community. And I think there are these two threads within the Christian tradition. And, you can pick and choose whether you're going Old Testament or New Testament. I think there's something really fundamental to me about the language around guns in the United States being about individual people having the right to individually defend them and their very narrow set of people that they love and care about, i.e. their family, right? So and that's an incredibly individualistic take on how you operate. And yet Jesus is message, right? The message of, you know, and I come from a Catholic small c, right? Well, I come from Catholic big C, but I consider myself Catholic small c sort of person, which is, you know, all in, right? That if there is anything that Jesus was calling for, it was about opening one's arms and existing and understanding yourself to exist in and with and being responsible to and for all these people. And that is actually something that I can't make sense of with this discussion about guns, because that conversation about guns very quickly gets to, I need to protect myself and my people, my super narrow vision of who's important, all while, you know, often at the same time proclaiming my sort of Christian identity, which to my mind, it calls for something very different and is actually not about yourself and your family. It is in fact about thinking about yourself and the, you know, nuclear family as being part of just one narrow, right? It's one piece of these ripples and these circles of community. And I also grapple with this because I grew up in a household where, you know, it was the Isaiah, you know, beat your swords into plowshares. Yeah. Passage. I'm like, where does violence show up in the Bible? I mean, it's like, beat the swords into plowshares. Yeah. Great.
Well,
you know, anyway, so there's this, to my mind, there's this individual versus communal conversation that I struggle with when I hear people talk about this.
I do think that the more that the party system, the two-party system plays off of fears, right? So it plays off of the public's fears of particular others. Currently, obviously, it's trans persons, but, you know, it's often immigrants, it's often people of color, whatever. It shifts and sort of all simultaneously. The more that fear is generated and fed and stoked, I do think for many Christians, many white American Christians, the answer is, if I have a gun, then I can keep the people I love safe, right? The level of fear is so escalated that I might as well have one to keep those I love safe, right?
Right. So the advertising slogan for the NRA is God won't always protect you, but a loaded gun will. So you're choosing your God there. I mean, that's just another form of idolatry, isn't it, Justin?
Yeah, so two things occurred to me as you guys were talking about the family and the individual stuff. Like, one is just how violent actually the emphasis on family has become, and it makes me think. I teach this course on peacemaking theologies, and we always talk about the movie Taken at the beginning. I don't know if you guys have seen Taken, but it's the one with Liam Neeson where his daughter is taken, and he just says at the, you know, he's like, I have a very particular set of skills, and he basically goes and kills, like, you know, hundreds of people in Europe in order to protect his daughter. But this is like seen as a virtue in kind of U.S. thinking about the family. Like, this is his love, right? And that it's proper that it be in relation only to those who are immediate kin. And yet I think that a lot of the laws that protect people from legal consequences if they do defend their homes and family, it's really about property. I think it's about private property. It's about that idea of, like, ownership, which is also about control. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, what's your net worth? That was his main question. Yeah. Yeah. So
it's troubling to me that it is a notion of family as property as well, which actually
absolutely
has completely problematic patriarchal roots. Like, it is, again, these things, we have shifted laws, but there are deep-seated understandings of who protects whom and why are you protecting it. And it wasn't that long ago that if you wives were the property of their husbands, children were the property of their husbands, that to protect your property, those people were property. And then you add on to it enslavement and these sorts of things. But that notion of, I think you're 100% right, that it ends up turning it into property, but it also, I think, reframes and diminishes the humanity of people in the process.
Yeah,
Right? Because
absolutely.
it actually seems to attach property value to people. And you can't, and you cannot claim, if you were to, for example, defend someone else on the street, you don't get that same pass, right?
No,
Because they
yeah.
are not understood to be part of your family, if you will, and as a result, not part of something you have the right to defend. And that really comes back to this notion, I think you're correct, of it belongs to you, right? So there's, I think we have not gotten as far in. I think we have changed laws in this country in ways that haven't really changed thinking and haven't really changed getting back to structural issues, right? These foundational conceptions of.
Well, the thing that confuses me is where is the kind of theological church leadership to confront, these kinds of very primal fears that glorify the gun when, to my mind, part of the promise of Judeo-Christianity is that there is a God who will respond to your fears, that like faith is one aspect of confronting this. But where is this leadership?
I'm not sure where the leadership is, but I will let the other two folks here say more. Maybe they have a view of where the leadership is, but I wish that the leadership of the Christian churches, at least here in the United States, would have ever met my grandmother, who passed away some years ago, who spoke with a broken English, she spoke English with a French accent, and she used to say to me in French, but the rough translation is, pray as if it depends upon God and act as if it depends upon you. It's a woman who said her rosary every single day to the day she died, never got an education, worked in the mills. Like, that was what she said. And I said, like, that is in fact what Jesus called on us to do. And I see church leadership being all about the prayer and claiming the prayer space as their space. And they want to stay, to my mind, very safe in that space, as opposed to being out there. And I think back to other movements that shifted things in this country, the civil rights movement, to name but one, where it was in fact because faith leaders stood on the literal front lines that things started to shift. And it's I'm troubled.
I mean, this is one of the things that gets me maybe the most discouraged in these conversations, is that I sometimes wonder if the context of the discussion and surrounding social activism is so rigged so as to diffuse or undercut any real faith-based social activist movement. And what I mean by that is that you see activist movements come along, they get subject to this kind of translation through our media apparatus, right? Like, how do we find out about what they're doing? Well, through a particular, again, corporately owned media apparatus that has its own particular agendas, right? And, I just sort of wonder, like, could the civil rights movement happen today in this context? We look back at it as this, great example of faith-based progressive activism, and sort of wonder, where are those leaders now, And I honestly wonder if some of those people aren't there, but the structural context around it is so challenging to present a kind of singular but also nuanced, in the way it needs to be, message, right? That can bring people around a kind of, again, faith-based platform for social activism, whether it be guns, whether it be anti-trans legislation. That's where I get really, where I get really down. I'm like, is such a movement even possible in a structural sense, right?
But
Go ahead, Liz. Yeah.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, the place that it's happening, that I see here in the Boston area, and I have seen in other places that I have lived in the United States, it is happening in the Black church. In the historic Black church. It is happening in churches and faith communities that have never had the luxury to stand outside of the material world, where the idea of faith and theology have not, much like we were talking about before with regards to environmental degradation, where faith leaders haven't had the luxury to step aside and say, my only role here is to be a prayerful presence, and I don't want to, quote unquote, get mixed up in politics, right? Where the existential, future of their communities, as in the people, the church, was at risk. And that is the legacy, right? So to be very blunt, I think if we're talking Christianity, I think we need to be really, really clear which Christian traditions and which Christian leaders we're talking about in the United States. Because it is not all Christian leaders, and it is not the whole Christian church. It is very much a white, straight, cisgendered, male Christian, mainline Christian set of leaders whose voices I don't hear. I hear other voices. I follow other voices. I will give a plug right here for following on Instagram, Black Liturgies. Amazing. Like, there are amazing people doing amazing work. And where it is not coming from is exactly the places and the people who have the most access to shaping, as you were saying, Nicolette, that means, the very narrow media control, right? Those, Sinclair Group and others who are, who really shape our media ecosystem. They're not doing it. Other people are doing it. And so as we're talking, I'm realizing you're talking here about the church or about Christianity. And I think I want to get really specific when I'm talking about it. I'm talking about, there's places that I'm not talking about. So yeah.
I want to talk about that section of Christianity that, condones gun culture, and even more, is all hopped up about the fact that this time, the shooter was a trans individual and, can otherize that person. Because as, we were talking about earlier, it comes down to this kind of microcosm of who I want to protect, and then anyone else is the other. And in this particular case, again, using the discourse of a certain interpretation of Christianity, gets to condemn that other.
Yeah. I do think in this era, much of my inspiration, to go back to what Liz was saying, much of my inspiration has been in seeing how activist communities like the Black Church, for which their political stances, their political activism is just it's just part of their DNA, right? And that's ongoing. And it's increasingly, I think, for good reason, focused on local politics, local legislation, the kinds of things that don't get as much feature in the national news, and those things are important too, but I remember during the protests of 2020, many of the church-led Black movements in Boston were focused particularly on Boston-specific political issues, right? The DA, right? Who's in charge of the system here, and pushing police reform on that level. And honestly, I realized as I, observed that taking place, that growing up as a white evangelical, I never learned anything about local level civic political action. I don't know the first thing about it, and that's something just like that's part of the DNA of their church community that really challenged me.
Oh yeah, absolutely. In Louisville as well, we've had, we have what's called the 9th Street Divide here, which is kind of where you can see neighborhoods that were redlined, and it's just very evident. And so we have a really segregated city, and in particularly a really segregated city in terms of church. And over the last about 10 years, there's been some initiatives to get churches working together, and it's called Empower West. So Empower West Louisville. And there have been book clubs that are kind of across the city, and, getting together, going to other parishes on Sunday and stuff like that, right? Getting to know people. And it's just amazing how the idea of, I mean, there's nothing that is abstract in the practice of faith in West Louisville, and because again, it hasn't been a luxury, but also, you know, in a way, you could call it luxury, or you could call it like strategic numbness on the part of the white church, that it's actually it's a luxury to be able to avoid such issues in terms of my own material flourishing, because the system's set up in a way that I benefit from. But there's also this really like an unwillingness. It's not just, it's like we're trying to protect ourselves in a way from having to reckon with that stuff, and that's why. Connected to the anti-trans legislation that has just been passed in Kentucky, as previous legislation related to education, critical race theory, and some of that stuff was about like, it was in the law that like teachers shouldn't be allowed to say that working hard is racist and stuff, and I was like, why? Who's even saying that, right? But as you dig in, you realize, oh, it's because they have a preferred narrative about why things are arranged the way they are, and why these neighborhoods are nice and these neighborhoods are impoverished. And I guess what they've been telling themselves is, we work hard. And so, yeah, no one was saying hard work is racist. They were saying, using that language to explain, structural inequity, that's racist, right? Because that's ignoring the problem. But yeah, so anyway, it's kind of, it's a luxury not to have to deal with it, but it's also like, it's a luxury that there are all these walls built around that luxury to protect it from ever being, unsettled. Not even challenged in terms of the material conditions, but like even just unsettled. We don't even want to think about it.
Right. Well, I want to thank everybody for our discussion today, especially since, I think we can all agree that, what Jesus and Christianity pushes hardest for is, social order, settled, don't rock the boat, especially if it's a fisherman's boat.